The mud was cold, a thick, cloying paste that sucked at Thomas Bennett's boots with every step. The air tasted of ash and cordite, a bitter film coating his tongue. It was March 7, 1945, 16:35 hours, on the east bank of the Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. Private First Class Bennett, a combat medic with the 9th Armoured Division, moved with a weary, practiced economy through the smoking wreckage of what had been, until a few hours ago, a formidable German defensive position. To his left, standing as a silent, miraculous rebuke to the destruction all around it, was the Ludendorff Bridge. It was intact. Against all odds and German engineering, their desperate demolition attempts had failed, leaving the stone and steel arch a gift, an invitation into the heart of Germany itself. The rumble of American tanks and trucks crossing, it was a constant, visceral tremor underfoot, the sound of a war rushing towards its end. The defenders who had failed to destroy it lay scattered among their fortifications. Bennett's eyes, trained by months of campaign from Normandy, didn't linger on the dead. They scanned for movement, for the subtle signs of life that meant his skills were needed. He checked a few bodies, his touch clinical, his expression neutral. Then he heard it. Not a groan, not a call for help, but a high-pitched, ragged whimpering. It was the sound of a wounded animal, a sound that didn't belong to a seasoned combat veteran. He followed the noise to a fresh shell crater, its edges still crumbling. At the bottom, crouched against the dirt wall, was a German soldier. He was clutching his left leg. His fingers stained dark crimson, where blood seeped through the coarse wool of his trousers. His right hand held a Luger pistol, but the way it trembled, wavering in the air, suggested he lacked either the will or the physical strength to use it. Bennett didn't draw his own sidearm. He simply stood at the crater's edge. "Hey," he said, his voice low and calm. "Easy there, son." The German's head snapped up. The pistol shook more violently, pointing in Bennett's general direction. Bennett could see his face clearly now. Smooth cheeks, untouched by a razor, barely touched by adolescence. Eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost hypnotic. His lips moved silently, forming words that might have been a prayer or a plea to a mother far away. The uniform, the Feldgrau, hung loose on a frame that looked under fade even before the chaos of battle had found him. This wasn't a soldier. This was a child wearing a soldier's costume, and the play had turned lethally real. "Medic," Bennett said, slowly raising his empty hands, palms out. "Sanit ter." The boy's face contorted, confusion wrestling with the fear. The gun didn't drop, but its aim faltered. Bennett took this as his cue. He slid carefully down the side of the crater, his movements slow and deliberate, non-threatening. As he took another step forward, the German's resolve shattered. He threw the pistol aside as if it had burned him, the weapon landing with a dull thud in the mud. He pressed himself back against the crater wall, his body curling into a fetal position, and began to sob. Not the controlled, grim tears of a man in pain, but the helpless, shuddering crying of a frightened child who had reached the absolute limit of what his soul could endure. Bennett knelt beside him in the mud. "All right now," he murmured, his voice a soft counterpoint to the boy's ragged breaths. "Let's have a look." He gently, but firmly, pried the boy's hands away from the leg wound. A jagged piece of shrapnel had torn through the calf muscle. It was messy, painful, but the bleeding wasn't arterial. It was survivable. He unslung his medical kit, the familiar canvas pouch anchor in the chaos. The boy watched, his sobs subsiding into hitched breaths, his eyes fixed on Bennett's hands, with an expression of complete incomprehension. As Bennett cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, picking out small bits of debris, the boy flinched but didn't pull away. It was as if Bennett were performing magic rather than basic trauma care. "You're going to be okay," Bennett said, knowing the boy probably didn't understand a word of English, but hoping the tone. Calm, reassuring, professional, would communicate what the language couldn't. "You're safe now. The fighting's done for you." He sprinkled sulfur powder into the wound, the boy hissing through his teeth at the sting, then began wrapping a clean bandage around the calf, securing it with a firm knot. The whole procedure took less than 3 minutes. When he was done, he pulled out his canteen. "Here," he said, offering it. The boy stared at the canteen for a moment, then took it with trembling hands. He drank greedily, water sloshing down his chin, drinking like he hadn't tasted anything clean in days. When he finished, he handed the canteen back. His eyes, still swimming with tears, met Bennett's. He whispered a single, guttural German word that needed no translation. "Why?" Bennett looked at the boy, at the fresh bandage on his leg, at the childish roundness still visible in his face beneath the grime and terror. He didn't have an answer that would fit into the German vocabulary he didn't possess. He didn't have an answer that would make sense of any of this. He just shrugged, a small, tired gesture, and reached out, patting the boy's shoulder gently. He got to his feet, his knees popping, and slung his medical kit back over his shoulder. He had to move on. There were other craters, other cries in the smoke. He climbed out of the depression, leaving the German teenager sitting in the dirt, staring at the clean, white bandage on his leg as if it evidence of something he had been told, with absolute certainty, was impossible. By March 1945, the Nazi regime was in its death throes, and in its final, convulsive act. It was systematically devouring its own future. The child army of the Reich's collapse was a horrifying reality. What had begun as a desperate measure, the conscription of the Volkssturm, and the combat deployment of the Hitler Youth, had evolved into standard practice. The German war machine, bled white by years of total war, was now feeding adolescent bodies into a military meat grinder that consumed them without any meaningful strategic effect, only adding to the sheer, senseless tragedy of the war's end. The statistics, cold and bureaucratic, documented an institutional child sacrifice. Between January and May of 1945, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 Hitler Youth members, aged 15 to 17, saw combat. In the final 5 months of the war, an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 of these teenagers were killed, with another 30,000 to 40,000 wounded. When American forces captured teenage German soldiers in the spring of 1945, the numbers were staggering. Approximately 35,000 to 45,000 teenage POWs were taken between March and May. Of those, an estimated 15,000 to 18,000 required immediate medical treatment. The average age of these captured Hitler Youth combatants was 16.3 years. Perhaps the most chilling statistic was an internal one. Approximately 85 to 90% of these boys genuinely believed the Americans executed prisoners. These teenage soldiers, some having received only 5 to 10 days of training, had been systematically conditioned by years of relentless Nazi propaganda to expect torture and execution upon capture. They had been taught that the Americans, particularly the Amis, were barbaric monsters, gangsters and subhumans who showed no mercy, especially to young soldiers who represented the future seed of German resistance. This indoctrination was so terrifyingly complete that many teenage POs, upon realizing capture was imminent, attempted suicide, genuinely believing that death by their own hand was a preferable, quicker end than the prolonged agony they were sure the Americans would inflict. This psychological conditioning created immense tactical problems for the advancing American forces. These boys, these children in uniform, often fought with a suicidal, fanatical desperation born not from courage or ideology, but from sheer, abject terror of capture. They couldn't surrender because, in their minds, surrender meant a fate worse than death. The propaganda designed to strengthen German resistance had instead created situations where frightened children, who should have been in schoolrooms, felt compelled to fight to the last bullet against veteran soldiers, all to avoid a fictionalized horror. For those who were wounded and captured, the shock of survival was a psychological earthquake. The discovery that American medics were not torturers but healers, that they were actually trying to save their lives, created a disorientation as profound as any physical trauma. The systematic kindness, the professional care, the gentle hands, it all contradicted, point by point, everything they had been taught about the American character. The initial response was often a stunned, wary disbelief. Wounded teenage POWs would watch American medics working on their injuries with expressions of dazed confusion, as if they were hallucinating or experiencing some elaborate, cruel deception that would inevitably end in the promised brutality. Some, in their terror, even refused treatment initially, preferring to die untreated from their wounds, rather than submit to what they believed was a prelude to torture. The act of mercy itself was suspect. A 16-year-old named Klaus Richter, captured with severe burns near Cologne, would later describe his psychological state. I had been taught, shown pictures even, that Americans skinned prisoners alive. That they particularly tortured young soldiers because we represented future resistance. So when the American medic knelt beside me, when he started cutting away my burnt uniform so gently, when he gave me morphine for the pain, I thought I was already dead. I thought this was some kind of afterlife hallucination. I simply could not process that the enemy, the monster, was trying to help me survive. The moment of realization, when the cognitive dissonance became too great and the propaganda farce aid crumbled, was often violently emotional. Boys who had maintained a stoic, terrified composure during their capture would suddenly break down, crying uncontrollably when the truth finally penetrated their fear. They were not going to be executed. The stories were lies. These men, these enemies, were treating them with more humanity and compassion than their own government and military had shown in its final, desperate days. The transformation happened with remarkable speed for most. Within hours of receiving consistent medical care, the ingrained terror would drain away, replaced first by profound confusion, then by a dawning gratitude, and finally, a tentative, fragile trust. The speed of this transformation demonstrated how shallow the Nazi conditioning had been. It was a structure built on fear, not conviction, and it collapsed immediately when confronted with contradictory evidence. Assasses, the field hospitals, established in tents, commandeered schools, and abandoned buildings behind the rapidly advancing front lines, became unlikely laboratories where former enemies discovered a shared humanity through the universal experience of pain, healing, and medical care. Wounded teenage German POWs received treatment in the same facilities, often in adjacent beds, as wounded American soldiers. They were attended by the same doctors, the same nurses, the same orderlies. This forced proximity was a powerful antidote to abstraction. An American sergeant from Kansas, recovering from a shrapnel wound in his side, would find himself next to a 16-year-old boy from the Ruhr who had a similar wound from an American grenade. The shared experience of being patients, of being vulnerable, of hurting and hoping, created a common ground where nationality and uniform became less important than the universal human desire to survive, to be free of pain, to see home again. The medical staff made no distinctions in the quality of care based on nationality. A teenage German POW with a bullet wound received the same precious antibiotics, the same skilled surgical intervention, the same measured doses of morphine, the same attentive nursing care as the American private in the next cot. This equal treatment, this quiet, unspoken commitment to the ethics of their profession, demonstrated values that Nazi propaganda had claimed Americans were incapable of possessing: fairness, compassion, and a respect for human life. Staff Sergeant Edward Morrison, a surgical technician at a field hospital near Frankfurt, observed the ward dynamics. We had American kids and German kids in the same long tent, all of them wounded, all of them scared, all of them just wanting to go home. At first, the German teenagers would just watch, their eyes following us everywhere. They'd watch how we talked to our own boys, how we changed their dressings, gave them water, joked with them to keep their spirits up. And then they'd realize, he's doing the same for me. The same gentle touch. The same morphine. You could actually see it in their faces, the exact moment the propaganda crumbled, being replaced by this dazed understanding that we actually gave a damn whether they lived or died. It was something to see. These field hospitals also became unlikely sites of cultural exchange, despite the language barriers. American GIs, bored and recovering, would share candy bars, cigarettes, and copies of A Stars and Stripes with the German teenagers in the neighboring beds. Nurses would learn basic German phrases, Schmerzen, for pain, Ruf, for rest, to better communicate with their young charges. The German boys, in turn, would haltingly practice their English, ask tentative questions about America, about baseball, about New York City they'd seen in movies. Some would even pull out water-stained, carefully folded photographs of their families. Mothers, fathers, little sisters. Their most treasured possessions. And share them, a silent plea to be seen not as fanatical Hitler youth, but as sons and brothers who were missed. Masseres. The medical care provided by American forces became, arguably, the most effective and immediate denazification tool for these captured teenage soldiers. No amount of formal re-education lectures or pamphlets could ever match the raw, persuasive power of experiencing mercy from the people they had been taught were merciless, of receiving compassionate, competent care from the enemies their propaganda had depicted as subhuman monsters. The psychological impact operated at multiple, devastating levels. The immediate, physical experience of gentle medical treatment directly contradicted the specific propaganda claims about American brutality and torture. The sustained quality of that care, day after day, demonstrated a systematic, organizational commitment to humanitarian values, not just the random kindness of a single individual. The sheer professional competence of the American medical personnel, their equipment, their drugs, their techniques, revealed a sophistication and organizational strength that contradicted Nazi claims about democratic decadence and chaos. A 17-year-old named Hermann Schultz, wounded during the brutal fighting in the Ruhr Pocket, described his transformation. I had spent 3 years in the Hitler Youth, being taught that Americans were subhuman criminals who would torture and execute German prisoners. Then American medics saved my life on the field. American nurses provided care in the hospital that was better than what I'd seen in our own military hospitals. And American soldiers in the beds around me shared their food with me. Every single thing I had been taught, every single lie, was revealed in that hospital tent. The medical care didn't just heal my wounds, it destroyed my entire faith in the Nazi ideology. It was like waking up from a nightmare. This denazification through medical care proved more effective than any formal program because it was experiential, not educational. These teenage POWs didn't read about American values in a booklet or hear a lecture about democracy. They lived it. They experienced, directly and personally, the evidence that Americans treated wounded enemies with dignity. That a democratic society could be simultaneously incredibly strong and profoundly compassionate that military power did not require cruelty to be effective. SSFs. For the American combat medics themselves, the work of treating these teenage German POWs carried a unique and heavy psychological burden, one that often exceeded the already significant trauma of treating their own wounded comrades. They were faced with the profound moral complexity of having to save the lives of young enemies whom they, or their friends, had just been trying to kill hours earlier. They struggled with a deep, simmering anger at the Nazi regime that had sent children to die in a lost cause, while simultaneously feeling a piercing grief for the stolen youth of these boys. The medics, often young men themselves in their early 20s, experienced a torrent of conflicting emotions, all at once the professional satisfaction of successfully saving a life, a cold rage at the German leaders who had sacrificed their children, a sorrow for the normal teenage years these boys had lost to warfare, a flicker of guilt about the American actions that had caused the wounds they were now treating, and a fierce, defiant pride in demonstrating the best of American values through their actions. Private First Class Robert Henderson, a medic with the 78th Division, kept a diary, and his entry from near Magdeburg was telling: treated a 15-year-old kid today. Shrapnel wounds to the chest and arm. He was terrified when I approached, kept trying to crawl away despite the wounds. When I finally got close enough to treat him, he was crying and begging in German. I think he was begging me to kill him quickly, rather than torture him. When he finally realized I was actually bandaging his wounds, cleaning him up, he looked at me like I was performing a miracle. I think I saved his life. Don't know how I feel about that. He tried to kill Americans yesterday. But he's just a kid who never had a choice. This war is all wrong. This emotional burden was particularly heavy for medics who were close in age to their patients. That small age gap, a 20-year-old medic from Ohio looking down at a 16-year-old boy from Hamburg, made identification easier and infinitely more painful. These medics could too easily imagine themselves in the positions of the teenage POWs. They could recognize how thin and arbitrary the line was between their own lives and the lives of the enemies they were treating. Some medics cope by consciously adopting paternal attitudes toward the teenage POWs, treating them as surrogate sons or little brothers rather than enemy combatants. Others maintained a strict, almost cold professional distance, focusing solely on the medical tasks, the wound, the bandage, the morphine, and walling off any emotional connection. Most, however, struggled daily to find a sustainable balance between the compassion that gave their grim work meaning and the detachment that made it bearable. In practice, American military medical doctrine, heavily influenced by the Geneva Conventions, made no legal or ethical distinctions based on age, nationality, or military status when treating wounded combatants. The provisions for medical neutrality were drummed into every medic during training, which emphasized treating all wounded as patients first, last, and always. Their mission was to save lives, full stop, regardless of the uniform those lives wore. But this clear-cut doctrine confronted a messy and emotionally charged reality when the wounded enemies were so obviously, heartbreakingly young. American medics who had treated hardened, fanatical, Wehrmacht veterans throughout the European campaign now found themselves providing the same care to boys who looked young enough to be in high school back home. The cognitive dissonance between enemy combatant and wounded child created moral and psychological challenges that their medical training had never addressed. Corporal James Walsh, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, captured this conflict in a letter to his wife. "We treat German wounded the same as our own. That's the Geneva Convention, and it's just army doctrine. But when the wounded German is 15 years old and is crying for his mother while you're working on him. The professional distance becomes impossible. You can't see an enemy soldier anymore. You just see a terrified kid who should be in a schoolroom somewhere, not bleeding out in a foxhole. It gets to you, often. The medical treatment provided to these teenage POWs far exceeded the minimum requirements of the Geneva Conventions. Medics would give an extra fraction of morphine to ease not just physical pain, but also visible psychological trauma. They would spend additional minutes sitting with a boy, offering quiet reassurance in broken German, or simply through a steady, calm presence. They shared their own personal supplies, cigarettes, candy, a spare pair of dry socks, and generally treated the young POWs with a paternal care that went far beyond the clinical requirements of their job. In many cases, the intense, intimate relationships formed between American medics and teenage German POWs during those critical moments of medical treatment created bonds that lasted far beyond the immediate crisis of the battlefield. Medics would make a point of checking on their boys during the recovery process in the aid stations or field hospitals. They would bring them extra rations, help them write letters to their families in Germany, or advocate for their transfer to more permanent, comfortable PW facilities. These bonds transcended the formal structures of captor and captive, victor and defeated, medic and patient. They became human relationships between individuals who had shared a profound life and death experience, one who had chosen to save a life, and one whose life had been saved. This shared experience created a connection that couldn't be adequately captured by military categories or national identities. Technical Sergeant Michael Romino, a chief medic who had treated dozens of teenage German POWs during the push into Germany, maintained correspondence with several of them after the war ended. In a letter to his wife in 1946, he tried to explain these ongoing connections. These kids didn't choose this war or this ideology. They were victims of it as much as our own wounded soldiers were. And when you save someone's life, when you hold their hand while they're scared and in pain, you become responsible for that life in some small, permanent way. I can't just walk away from the boys I patched up and pretend they don't matter anymore. They matter because they're human beings who deserved a hell of a lot better than what their own government gave them. The post-war correspondence between American medics and their former patients documented these ongoing, unlikely relationships. The letters were not about the war, but about recovery, about rebuilding shattered lives, about hopes for the future. They expressed a gratitude and a connection that transcended national boundaries and the recent enmity of war. They were living proof that an act of mercy during conflict could create the fragile, human foundations for peace after the guns fell silent. The systematic provision of medical care to teenage German POWs created a transformation that operated on both an individual and a collective level. Individually, thousands of German teenagers discovered, in the most visceral way possible, that their enemies could be merciful. Collectively, an entire generation of young Germans, who would go on to rebuild their shattered nation, experienced American values not through propaganda, but through direct, personal action. This first-hand experience profoundly influenced post-war German attitudes toward America and democracy. The young men who had expected execution and instead received compassionate medical care became natural advocates for Western alignment during the early, tense debates of the Cold War. They told their families, their friends, and eventually their own children, the story of the American medics who had saved their lives when their own leaders. Propaganda had promised them only death. It was a story with the power to cancel out years of anti-American indoctrination. The medical care also shaped America's own understanding of what its military had achieved. For the medics who had treated these boys, their service held a deeper meaning beyond mere military victory. They had saved enemy lives when they could have let them die. They had demonstrated, under the most extreme conditions, that American values included mercy toward the defeated, especially toward the young, who had never truly been given a choice. They had proven that their nation could fight with relentless strength and yet still retain its humanity. Sex on March 7, 1995, 50 years to the day after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge. An 80-year-old Thomas Bennett attended a quiet anniversary ceremony in the now peaceful German town of Remagen. The bridge was long gone, its ruins still visible in the river, a memorial to that frantic, pivotal day. After the formal events, as Bennett stood looking at the water, a man approached him. The man was in his late 60s, prosperous, looking in a well-cut business suit, walking with a barely perceptible limp. He studied Bennett's face for a long moment, his own expression a mixture of hesitation and certainty. "Saniteur," he said, his voice soft with a German accent. "Bennett, you are Thomas Bennett." Bennett turned, his old eyes squinting. "I am." The German's composed demeanor seemed to soften. "You treated my leg wound on the day the Americans took the bridge. I was 16 years old. I had a pistol. I was crying." He paused, gathering himself. "I expected to be executed. You saved my life. And you showed me, in 10 minutes, that everything I had been taught about Americans was propaganda." Memories, faded but never lost, flooded back across the 5 decades. Bennett saw past the wrinkles and the distinguished grey hair, past the successful doctor, to the terrified boy in the muddy crater. "Klaus?" he asked. His voice tentative. "Klaus Richter." The German's eyes glistened. "Yes, I live in Bonn now. I am a doctor. A surgeon." He gestured slightly with his hands. The skilled hands of a healer. "I chose medicine because of what you did that day. You showed me that healing is always stronger than harming. That mercy matters, even during war, especially during war. I have spent my entire career trying to live up to the example you set when you treated an enemy child with the same care you would give a friend." A Bennett, a man not given to great shows of emotion, found himself unable to speak. He simply reached out and embraced the man who had once been a boy he saved. When they parted, Bennett wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I was just doing my job, son," he said quietly. "The Geneva Convention. We treated all wounded. That's what we did." "No," Richter insisted, his voice firm but gentle. "The convention said the minimum you had to do. You did more. You gave comfort along with the care. You treated me like I mattered, like my life had value, even though I had been your enemy just hours earlier. That extra measure of humanity, that is what changed me. That is what I have tried to pass forward through my own medical career." The story of the American medics and the teenage German POWs never became a celebrated part of the popular history of World War II. It was overshadowed by the grand narratives of strategy, the drama of D-Day and the Bulge, the iconic images of tanks and generals. Medical care for wounded enemies does not produce stirring, simple imagery. There are no clear heroes planting flags, only tired men kneeling in the mud, doing their duty. But for the thousands of teenage German soldiers who survived wounds that would have killed them without American medical intervention, the medics who treated them represented the truest, most profound victory America achieved in Europe. It was not just the defeat of a monstrous regime, but the positive demonstration that democratic values, compassion, the rule of law, the inherent worth of the individual, could survive even the hell of total war. The teenagers who expected execution and received medical care instead carried that experience like a sacred trust throughout their lives. They became the generation that rebuilt Germany as a robust democracy. They became the citizens who, when the Cold War divided the world, aligned their nation firmly with the West. They taught their children that the American soldiers who came in 1945 were not conquerors but liberators. Liberators from a tyranny that had ultimately betrayed its own children. And it began with medics. Men like Thomas Bennett, who knelt in the mud beside wounded teenage enemies when they could have walked away, who cleaned wounds and wrapped bandages when they could have withheld treatment, who offered sips of water, doses of morphine, and simple human comfort to boys who, just hours before, had been trying to kill Americans. They proved that mercy could survive even amidst total war's brutality. That professional ethics could transcend national hatreds. That treating enemy children with humanity would create the foundations for a peace that military victory alone could never build. The bandages they wrapped on teenage German legs and arms, the splints they set on broken bones, the morphine they administered, these were not just medical supplies. They were bridges. They were bridges built across the deepest chasm that war can create, the divide between us and them. And in the end, those bridges, woven from gauze and compassion, proved stronger than any bomb or bullet in building the peaceful, united Europe that would eventually rise from the war's terrible ruins.